Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to all our past presidents, board members, panelists, committee members, and all other participants for today's very exciting conclave on creating a $5 trillion economy. As you all know, we have a very high-profile panel to discuss their vision and how India Inc. can be a part of this unstoppable journey. My sincere thanks to Axis Bank, Kotak Mutual Fund, Tata Chemicals, True CSR, RSV Solutions, and Harinagar Sugar Mill for supporting this conclave. Before I invite our President, Bombay Chamber and founder, Avaana Capital, Ms. Anjali Bansal, to deliver the welcome address, I would like to inform all of you about two post-budget sessions that the Chamber is organizing in the first week of Feb. The first one is on taxation, scheduled for the 4th of Feb at 4 p.m. This will be moderated by Ms. Rajshree Sabnavis, Chairperson of our Direct Tax Committee, and has Ms. Renu Narvekar of TCS, Mr. Kalpesh Desai of KPMG, Mr. Shravan Kumar of L&T, Mr. Kevu Shah of ENY, and Mr. Frank D'Souza of Price Waterhouse as panelists. A high-profile panel indeed, which will analyze the key tax changes in the union budget and its implication for all of us. This is followed by a session on the 5th at 4 p.m. on the overall impact of the budget and how this will shape up our economy, the markets, and ensuring a long-term growth. This panel is being moderated by Dr. Sachinandan Shukla, Chairperson of our Economic Research Policy and Development, and has Mr. Nilesh Shah, Senior Vice President, Bombay Chamber, Professor Anant Narayan of SP Jain Institute of Management and Research, Mr. Utpal State of Trust, and Abhiza Devanji of ENY. So looking forward to meeting all of you on 4th and 5th for these two exciting sessions as well. And with that, may I hand it over to Anjali. Anjali.
Thank you, Sandeep. Namaste, good evening to everyone, and welcome to the Bombay Chamber Conclave. Distinguished panelists, moderators, past presidents, members of Bombay Chamber Board, distinguished guests, our members themselves, ladies and gentlemen. Bombay Chamber of Commerce and Industry, which, as you would know, is amongst the oldest operating chambers of commerce in India. So today, it is my unique privilege to welcome you on behalf of the Chamber at this conclave, which is sort of pre-budget, but really a run-up to the budget, but broader than that. It is the aspirations of close to 1.4 billion Indians on creating a $5 trillion economy in this context. At the outset, on behalf of the Chamber and myself, I want to thank our distinguished panelists for accepting our invitation to speak on the subject, which is both very topical and very important. My special thanks to Nilesh Shah, my colleague in the Bombay Chamber, Senior Vice President, my other colleagues, Dr. Sachinandan Shukla, who is Chair of Economic Policy Research and Development Committee, Indranil Pan, who is co-chair of the Economic Policy Research and Development Committee, as well as Shri Sandeep Khosla, who is the Director General of the Chamber, for all the relentless efforts to make today a reality. A couple of things about the Chamber, as many of you know, Chamber has had a very long and illustrious history, established in 1836. In fact, it was under the Chamber's aegis that the first railway line was laid in India as well. The Chamber represents a wide spectrum of large corporates, MSMEs, and increasingly, as we involve the innovation ecosystem, a number of startup members in our ranks as well. We act, or we aim to act, as a bridge between civil society, government, member organizations, to promote the interests of all these stakeholders in the overall interest of the country. Our speakers today need no introduction, so I'm not going to go into lengthy introductions of our speakers. I just want to mention two more things. One is, today's discussion is really in the context also with the backdrop of the Chamber's 4 mission pillars: generating sustainable growth, sustainable economic growth for our country as we move forward, sustainable growth that is also inclusive, that carries everyone together forward through ease of doing business, and leveraging digitization and innovation across all aspects of our businesses and our lives. The Honorable Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi has often said, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Prayas. So altogether, as we move forward into really taking our place on the global stage as not just an economic superpower, but also as a role model really for creating the sustainable, inclusive, innovation-led growth. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to my Bombay Chamber colleagues to carry the session forward. Thank you once again for attending today.
Thank you, Ms. Bansal. Thank you, DG. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to this conclave. The broader theme being creating a $5 trillion economy. It is my pleasure to be interacting with a fantastic set of panelists, Dr. Ashima Goel, Neelkant Mishra, Indranil Pan, and Shailesh Pathak. None of these people really needs a formal introduction. So what I'm going to do over the next, say, 45 odd minutes is I'll try to get their take on the broader theme, as well as pick their brains on reinvigorating India growth story. And as you know, we are just very close to the budget. So maybe things which could be very relevant, themes that could be very relevant from an expectations perspective. I will try and get their views. Before I engage with the panelists with a couple of questions thrown at each one of them, and I do expect about 3-4 minute responses to the questions, and then finally, we will be open for Q&A. Just a little background for the budget. Now, this budget has a unique backdrop. There is this pandemic that we have that still rages on after nearly 2 years, right? Now, we're still grappling with the narrative and the fixes. And as we speak, about 70% of the advanced economies have been able to fully vaccinate their populations, right? 70% of the populations fully vaccinated with double doses and even booster doses. But sadly, just about 4% of the population of low-income economies has been fully vaccinated. We just had the IMF's January World Economic Outlook. They have pared down global GDP growth rate. They have also pared India's growth forecast down. We just saw the Fed, and that seems to have again induced some fear of God in markets, right? We have been seeing that for some time, last few days. We've had 47 plus rate hikes in the last quarter of 21. Crude is at a 7-year high. We have the Russia-Ukraine issue on the boil. And therefore, I think this is a very, very unique sort of a challenge or challenging backdrop to the budget. And therefore, the budget must really act as an agent of change in ushering India towards its aspirational goals that Ms. Bansal also spoke about. And as we know, the economic and social impacts have disrupted all walks of life. There are multiple fault lines in the economy in the form of widening inequality. And this again is all pervasive of all forms: income, access to healthcare, access to education, and all of that. So this might sound very cliched, but the budget will really have to do a very tightrope walk, given the need to boost expenditure to support needy sections of the economy, and at the same time, try and balance it out with the current high fiscal deficit and public debt. I'm reminded of US President Ronald Reagan's quote, the government is like a baby's elementary canal, right? A happy appetite at one end and no responsibility at the other. But in India, we've seen that the fisc has been very, very responsible. Some might even argue that they've been very, very conservative, even during the worst of the crisis. And with that, Professor Ashima Goel, I just wanted to come to you. Essentially, if you look at the GDP growth estimates of anywhere between 9 to 9.5% for FY20, and there is a K-shaped recovery right now, and there is worsening inequality. We are still about 5-7% lower than the pre-pandemic path, and the recovery is very, very patchy. So the key question is, and which I want to ask you, is how do we impart this growth push while normalizing the fiscal policy and preserving macro stability? And is there a need for continuity of the monetary and fiscal tango for long-term growth?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And I think this topic is very relevant. The Chamber's objectives are just what is required. It's sort of longer term than the budget itself. And so I think that this budget, because we have been going through steady fiscal reform, that way I would look for continuity in this budget. This reform is paying off. If you see, we've gone through a lot of costs of reform, tax reform, GST, etc., but we are seeing buoyancy in revenues now. This gives some space to tackle this K-shaped recovery inequality issues while continuing on the fiscal consolidation path. Because tax buoyancy and the successful, some disinvestment schemes, etc., give them the funds to spend more on stimulus. And also because one of the things they have done, the reforms which is really paying off, is a transformation of public expenditure towards what is more productive, or as a higher multiplier, as we put it in the jargon, towards infrastructure, green infrastructure, and so on. But the point about this is it takes time to ramp up. And meanwhile, we are seeing a lot of cash balances, especially with state governments. So I think there can be transient kind of targeted and temporary tax cuts which help consumption revive. And even when I was in the PMEAC, Nilesh will remember, it's nice to have him be on a panel with him again. So I used to talk about some kind of, Nariga scheme for the urban sector, maybe some employment subsidy for MSMEs. So, and the scheme could be targeted on setting up primary healthcare centers, which we've been doing with increasing vaccination. And that is an enormous source of employment also. So then this is a way in which you can give stimulus, improve the quality of expenditure, and help the vulnerable at the same time. Then about monetary fiscal policy, I think that both have been working very well together through the pandemic. And that is one reason why India's recovery and financial sector stability has surprised everyone. Outlook was very grim. Most analysts had very pessimistic outlooks, but India has done quite well given the horrible times we have gone through. And here, there is a unique, we are seeing this as public debt levels rise throughout the world, we're talking about this. But in India, where very often the sources of inflation are supply bottlenecks, now it's become a worldwide issue. Fiscal action can reduce these bottlenecks, the cost of doing business, ease of doing business. All this reduces costs for business and it affects inflation. So fiscal action in these areas gives the monetary policy room to maintain a accommodative stance, so to maintain some stimulus. But it is an inflation targeting regime, so we are very careful that inflationary expectations do not stay anchored. And I think the inflation target does help in that, because you see the markets now, they're talking about 6% inflation, but not 10% as we used to have, right? So as long as inflation remains within the tolerance band, policy can be accommodated. Now, these are my personal opinions, not those of the MPC. We saw this happen in November, because when we were meeting, then oil prices were on the boil, and the expectations survey showed household expectations shooting up. But just in 4th November, they had those tax cuts. And then we did another survey and expectations really moderated. And that had some effect on inflation also, which stayed within the tolerance band. So supply side action and this coordination. And if rates of interest are low, we know India has a disadvantage of very high public debt, high borrowing costs. Interest payments make a large share of the total, take away a large chunk of revenue, 3 to 4%. So keeping this moderate and that R less than G, which means the denominator is rising, so debt ratios fall. It's very, very important for fiscal consolidation also. Then finally, I think that this improved expenditure, so health, education, restructuring of government towards this. And here, coordination with the states is very, very important, because these are on the concurrent list. And I think that's why as a country, we've not been able to spend well in these areas. So I've been talking about longer term institutional strengthening. That is, revive some kind of fiscal council, interstate fiscal council using the GST experience. And, good practices, because you're talking about rationalizing the centrally sponsored schemes, but states also have thousands of schemes which are never shut. So some coordination in this, helping better delivery of essential public services. Yeah, thank you. I'll stop there.
Nilkant, if I may turn to you, This is something that Professor Goel just spoke about. There was a time when RBI would allow no more than, say, 2 lakh crore as system liquidity, right? And now you have 4 to 5 lakh crore just government balance, cash balance sitting with RBI alone. Is it symptomatic of a say worrying trend? I think you've described it very well in one of your articles or interactions. You call it the expenditure problem of the government. Could you please explain it to our members and us?
Yeah. Thank you, Sachidanand. Thank you for inviting me here. So there are near-term aspects to that, and I'll describe it as well. And there are more strategic and medium-term sort of dimensions to that problem. The first is that right now, as Dr. Goel also mentioned, state and central governments are sitting on 4.5–5 lakh crores of cash. I think the root cause of that is the lockdowns affecting government functioning. Right. So you and I have been, and most people, I guess, on this call have been able to function from home for the last 2 years, but governments where physical files have to move, Babu file lana, now there's no Babu and there's no file, right? So, and it is sometimes very hard and it's illegal to move files out of office. So governments have struggled to spend, not just capex, but I would say even revenue expenditure. So as the economy opens up, as people come to office, as the files start moving, as the processes take over, I think the expenditure numbers will definitely start picking up. And I think that will be a very important stimulus for the economy, because state governments and central governments, together, the capex numbers are quite substantial. There is a slightly more medium-term aspect to this, which is that as tax to GDP starts to go up, because one of the reasons why there is so much of surplus cash is also that tax collections have been very robust. So if we are able to get our tax to GDP up, and the markets are geared for more higher fiscal deficits, then you're obviously borrowing more. And governments need to be able to learn to spend productively instead of just raising salaries and figuring out a way of blowing up the money. And if you see expenditure to GDP in even mid-income economies, they are higher than where we are. And I think the capacity of the state, both at the central level and the state level, needs to expand, and expand in a productive way, right? Not just sort of throwing cash to people and raising salaries of government employees, because there is a lot more role, say, in education, in health, in social safety nets. I think there's a lot more that the government needs to do for the economy to function productively. And I think these are questions which had been put on the back burner over the past decade, because the challenge was to get the fiscal deficit down. Right now, with the debt to GDP at 89–90%, I think the only way you can get it down is by growing the denominator, right? The nominal GDP. And the challenge for the government now, or governments, I would say, state and center, is that a lot of the expenditure of the last 2 years is going to roll off, right? So it's not going to roll over, it's going to roll off. So 85,000 crores of vaccine expenditure, a lot of the food subsidy next year, possibly fertilizer subsidy will have to be lower, possibly Narega allocations will be lower. So if there is 3.5 lakh crores of expenditure rolling off, and if the government doesn't compensate for that by spending elsewhere, then actually it could be a negative impetus for the economy. And right now we are in this sorry state where the financial markets have tightened well in advance, meaning the normalization is only just starting to happen in the economy, and interest rates, 10-year bond yields are at 6.7. State governments are borrowing at well above 7.5. So all the costs of a higher fiscal deficit have been borne, but very few of the benefits have come through. So while expenditure to GDP has gone up, it has gone up because interest costs have gone up, it is because pension payments have gone up, it is because salary costs have gone up, not because productive expenditure is happening. So this is both an immediate problem to get it off the ground so that the economy revives. It's also a medium-term problem of resetting the narrative around what the governments need to do. I'll stop.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point to make, Neelkant, of bearing the costs and then not really getting any benefits of that. So I'll just turn to Mr. Pathak. Mr. Pathak, you've been with the bureaucracy, you've been an IS officer and also a doer, right? You've been a private equity investor and a lender. And you've seen the infra space very, very closely. And the last budget was all about borrowing to spend on infrastructure. Do you think this is the classic mistaking articulation for action syndrome in the infra space? And also, I think one thing that I wanted to ask you was, have we moved away from the roti kapda makan to bijli pani sadak and beyond that now? I mean, what's your take? Is this time for taking the infra story beyond the usual bijli pani sadak?
Thank you. I'll just begin by saying that the budget is nothing but a receipt and expenditure statement. And it's a means to the end of translating the government's manifesto into implemented outcomes. So if you really look at the long view, this government actually, the first speech of the president to the combined houses of parliament in 2014, 9th of May, it's worth revisiting that. And most of the announcements in that have been achieved. Then again, you come back to the 17th Lok Sabha, June 2019, and the president's speech. So the way to analyze a budget or a series of budgets is how they are measuring up to the announcements made to the first sitting of the joint houses of parliament. But specifically, we're just 5 days away, so nothing that we are going to say now is going to substantially change the budget on the 1st of February. But over the last 18 months, 4 Ns are pretty good. The announcement of 4 Ns, the National Infrastructure Pipeline, the National Monetization Pipeline, the National Bank for Financing Infrastructure and Development, which is going to be in Mumbai, and the seldom talked about, but very important, NPMMF, which is how to do it, how to create the capacity, how to get the professionals in place, the National Program and Policy Management Framework. But going back to what you said, the definition of infrastructure as per the union government is not just, bijli pani sadak. The harmonized list of infrastructure subsectors include transport and logistics, energy, water and sanitation, communication, and social and commercial infrastructure. So we've only just begun. And let me give a Bombay-based example. In 2002, those of us who would remember that the expressway between Mumbai and Pune started. Now, this is what I call trunk infrastructure. Once the two cities were connected using expressway, we haven't seen a second or a third expressway. But if you really think about it, in the last 2 decades, both Mumbai and Pune have grown like this in terms of cities. So my submission to all of us is trunk infrastructure in India will get built by the time we get to 5 trillion. But by the time we get to 10 trillion, by 20 trillion, the cities will keep growing. So maybe the time to focus now is on cities and the infrastructure of cities, including tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 cities. Last point, I'd say that, when you talk about 5 trillion, it's not going to be a 1 trillion Maharashtra, 1 trillion UP, 1 trillion Tamil Nadu. We have to get the laggards in India up. And to that extent, I'm very happy to see the 2 landmark programs. One is the Jal Jeevan Mission. So just to give you a number, there are 192 million households in India, in rural India, 19 crore rural households. Only 1 out of these 6 had a tap water connection in their homes, roughly 2.5 years ago. Today, 3 out of 6 have tap water. And in another 2 years, all 6 will have tap water. Now, this is stupendous infrastructure. Nobody talks about that. And finally, what about the poorer states? So for every Maharashtra and every Tamil Nadu and every Gujarat, there is a Bihar, there's an Eastern UP, there's a Chhattisgarh, which need to be firing. Unless they fire on all cylinders, India is not going to hit top speed. Thank you.
Absolutely. Indranil, if you look at the government debt, right, we are say 90% of GDP as against less than 70% before the pandemic hit. And we've seen the interest burden really rise. If I were to look at the numbers for say F22, we will have the share of interest at close to say 41 odd percent, right? I mean, it used to be around 34-35% typically over the last decade. How do you see the budget numbers with respect to say some headroom? I mean, like I said, everybody is expecting the budget to do something in terms of spending, and given the K-shaped recovery, do you think that the budget maths really, with the kind of say line items that we have, interest, expenditure, etc., do you really see any room for any meaningful expenditure with expectations being sky high from this budget?
I think I would agree with Mr. Sailesh when he pointed out that the budget is just a sort of balance sheet of the government, simply because a lot of policies have been taken even beyond the budget date. In terms of the budget mathematics for this year, I think it's quite a tricky situation for the government. Number one, the advantage of the high tax revenues that we were able to collect this year, and which outstripped the budget expectations by a far margin, was not because of economic activity taking off in a very significant way. It was more due to the extremely high nominal GDP that we would end up this year with, simply because inflation was relatively on the higher side. Now, what is the number, or what is the GDP number that the government assumes for the budgeting exercise next year will be extremely relevant. If you look at the 9.2% advance estimate, it clearly indicates that the second half growth is likely to be only at around 5%. Now, is that the full employment level of growth, or is that the potential level of growth after the pandemic? Simply because the year before we entered the pandemic, we had ended that year at around 4%. So a lot of these questions will become relevant for the budget mathematics and how you sort of shape the, therefore model the tax collections and therefore model the expenditures. Now, to that extent, I think very clearly this is not a year of consolidation. This is also not a year of consolidation because globally financial markets are tightening. And when your financial markets are tightening, I think given the type of K-shaped recovery that you have had in India, to sort of rectify for that, the government needs to be redistributive, which necessarily means that it's very difficult to move yourself away also from strictly what you call revenue expenditures into capital expenditures. In terms of the focus area, I think the very critical areas which we have talked about for significant number of years, but the problems have been laid extremely bare post the pandemic, is the education sector and the healthcare sector. And very clearly, I think apart from the inequitable distribution of wealth and income, if we don't take care of the health sector and the education sector, my fear is out of the pandemic, the productivity level for the India would actually continue to suffer for multiple years. So even more important than the hard infrastructure, which quote unquote gives multiplier effects, agreeing to the fact that you have till about November, and that's the point Neelkant also made, you've had low pace of capital growth, capital expenditure growth in the economy. I think the clear focus of the government now needs to be health and education. How you close the gap between the outlay and the outcomes, and also sort of make it more inclusive for the Indian population. And that is very important, in my opinion, for the overall productivity growth of the economy. And unless we do this, unless we have a clear focus on that and a clear blueprint for this, the potential growth rate for the Indian economy could suffer, which in turn may actually make the debt relatively unsustainable.
Thank you, Indranil. Professor Goyal, just it sounds blasphemous if I don't ask you anything related to monetary policy, but I respect, I know that you have your quiet period. So something which is maybe closely related with the Fed backdrop, really fresh in everybody's mind. Do you think this reversal in global monetary policy cycle led by the Fed, how is India really prepared? Do you think we have the wherewithal, including the kind of forex kitty that we have, better prepared than last time or any other episode in the past?
Yes, I think we are definitely better prepared than the initial taper on in 2013 when we had very large double deficits and inflation was high and so on. This time, I think the US is the one country which has really high inflation. And that time India was unique in the world in having high inflation, and the rest of the world had low inflation. So that also makes a difference because the real interest differentials are not that large. And US inflation is due to their specific overheating, excessive fiscal stimulus, and labor market. People are unwilling to return to work, so labor market tightening. We don't have any of those issues here. And regarding, and I think there is one issue which is little appreciated, which is this that we are focusing on headline consumer inflation as our target. And that is more amenable to domestic policy action compared to WPI, which is international shocks. And oil prices have been extremely volatile, and it is a problem for us since we are dependent on oil imports. But the degree of dependence is coming down somewhat. And in an inflation targeting regime, you're able to look through temporary fluctuations to some extent. We've done it over the past year. Now let us see the futures market show some softening. So I expect continued volatility in oil prices. And I don't think it will necessarily pass through to our inflation if we are able to take other supply side action. And our large foreign exchange reserves insulate us from some outflows. But overall, if you notice, India has the highest expected rate of growth among all countries, in fact, because even China is expected to grow slowly. So foreign inflows are somewhat selective to that extent. Then there's this index inclusion issue. So it's not necessarily true that we'll see large outflows either. We have to see what happens. But if there are some outflows, we have the ability to take care of that without necessarily suffering sharp shocks in our financial markets. Yeah.
Thank you. That sounds very reassuring. Neelkant, I think you touched upon this topic, but I want you to elaborate on the asynchronous fiscal cycles that we see, and given the way center and state finances move, right? Typically, I mean, when we're trying to get out of trouble via spending and using the fiscal levers, having exhausted the monetary ones, how do you see the state budgets and the spending really impacting the medium-term story of India? I mean, if you can elaborate on that, I think you've had very strong views over there as well.
Yeah, so I think that more than the state governments, which are very, very large in number. I mean, the very large number of people, very complex organizations. I think it is far easier to educate the markets, and sadly, I have failed to do that. Which is that everyone obsesses about. So I'm reasonably clear that whenever the state governments put out their revised estimates for FY22, where I'm 99.9% sure that the RE deficit for state governments will be higher than the BE deficits of 3.6%. We will say, oh my God, look at the irresponsible states. Oh my God, there is a fiscal problem. But no one will make the observation that in each of the years in the last decade, the actual fiscal deficit has been substantially lower than the revised estimate. So when you're looking at borrowing requirements, I think it's important to look at what the state governments are actually borrowing instead of what they are planning to borrow, and what their actual deficits are versus what. So I think it is far easier to make the markets aware of all these dynamics. Sadly, no one does all that. In terms of changing state government behavior, I think that's something that at least when we are doing reasonable case analysis, I don't think we should expect anything to change substantially in the next 5 years. There will be, I think, there is a certain pace at which organizations evolve. One hopes that shocks of the last 2 years have encouraged state governments to do more online work, distribute more resources, digital resources, do more of disaster recovery planning. So I think they do have very robust disaster recovery planning. So if you have a flood or a bad fire, I think the governments are very well prepared. But if you have a 6-month, 12-month pandemic which forces people to work from home, there is zero preparation. So one hopes that those kind of processes will change. But at least from the perspective of ramping up the state's ability to spend, I think we should be less hopeful. What can happen and perhaps should happen is that the center and the states, and using one example that Dr. Goyal mentioned, and I think we've been discussing for a while, that some sort of a coordination council where states and center come together and do productive spending. So, for example, we know, and we have been exposed on the healthcare side, that there were districts after districts lacking hospitals and hospital beds. We know we have young kids who are going to be working age in 10 to 15 years, and they've lost 2 years of education, and they've actually regressed. And how do we get them back up to speed? And these are things that states individually may not be capable of solving. So states and center must come together, pool together their quite substantial fiscal resources, and then try to solve problems. Look at the Nal Se Jal scheme that Shailesh mentioned. Drinking water, especially at the rural level, is a state subject. I mean, Awas Yojana, rural housing is a state subject. There is no reason why on these important things, the states and the center cannot come together and create schemes which actually drive these changes. So those would be the wish list. Though when we are projecting, I think it is prudent to assume that the progress will be very slow.
Thank you, Nilkant. Mr. Pathak, just wanted your views quickly in terms of how can we really construct at speed and scale, right? This is something that I think you have spoken about quite often. And you said that there is a lot to be done, lot to be built. How do we do that at speed and scale?
Thank you. This is very close to my heart. And let me begin by saying financing is a problem that can be solved. The other problems are far more intractable. So just to give you an example, our company created a 13-kilometer metro in Mauritius in 2 years flat, from concept to commissioning. So this can happen in India as well. Why doesn't it happen? Because it is not the stuff that you do wearing a hard hat or wearing a yellow reflector jacket. It is the pre-construction activities that take up far longer in our country. But if keeping in the budget mood, if there are 4 C's that I can ask for, the first was already mentioned by Nilkant, which is coordination. C for coordination. Now we have a lot of coordination in the Government of India's ministries. We need similar coordination between the Government of India and the Government of States and the Government of Cities or the rural areas. So that's coordination. The second is also mentioned by other panelists, which is capacity. I mean, is the government of Gujarat or government of Bihar equally capable in administering public policy? The third is contracts. And this is a bugbear for all of us in business. Contract enforcement and dispute resolution is a horrible chapter in Indian economic life. Why can't we have better contract enforcement? In terms of construction, I am now advocating for a specific construction law, which gets us prompt payments and quickens construction. Very often, lack of cash flow leads to delays in construction. And the final thing is confidence. How can we, as a country, become more confident? If, let us say, you or I were in the restaurant business, we would not be very confident right now. So can we say that after May, this Omicron is going to leave us? The way the 1918 pandemic petered out, this will peter out, and the next financial year is going to be far, far better for the economy without any lockdowns, without any science-based restrictions? Thanks.
Thank you. Indradil, if I were to just ask you this last question. You have spoken about education and health really from a productivity perspective. Are there any specifics that you want or you're looking at from this budget? And also your views on India's inclusion in the global, say, bond indices. How do you see this impacting, say, cost of borrowings? Very quick.
The easier question is the second one that you raised. Now, I don't know what Nilesh's view is on this, but I think we are slightly still away from getting included in the bond index. We will look for clarities on the tax side in the budget. If it comes, it possibly is coming on in November. Now, the point that I want to make, however, is that it's not like a rocket science that suddenly if you get included in the bond index, 25 billion will just flow in through your window and you'll be a happy soul. It doesn't really happen like that, in the sense that you anyways have a high debt GDP ratio. Now, high debt GDP ratio also comes in the context of peer-rated countries having a much better per capita income GDP, which necessarily has a reflection in terms of how you can pay off your debt. So it's debt servicing is the critical issue. As I said, fiscal consolidation is not on in the current financial year. We'll have to sort of decide and see what happens in the next financial year, given the trajectory of the economic growth. So even if we get included in the bond index, I'm not extremely sort of hopeful that suddenly you have a flood of liquidity and your bond yields correct significantly lower. I don't think that is going to happen. Secondly, in terms of the healthcare and the education, I think very honestly, I think the first expectation from my side, with all due respect to the finance minister, is not to point out that your healthcare expenditure has gone up by 137%. By including the vaccination cost, which is likely to be a one-off, by including sanitation and water. I know that's important for healthcare, but in healthcare, I think the critical sort of factor that I would look forward to is the capacity building in healthcare, which is basically caregivers as a proportion of the patient. So to that extent, you really need to have hard money put into the healthcare system to clearly develop infrastructure in the healthcare to take care of future events like the current pandemic, and also to reach healthcare services to the lowest grassroots level of the economy. With respect to education, I think there needs to be a very clear course content that needs to be evolved, especially in the case of, say, rural children who might have a 3G connection, may not a 4G connection, but they still struggle for the equipment through which they would possibly be attending classes. So these are some of the things that is definitely not solvable within the period of just 1 year, but at least a roadmap and a start needs to be made, and that's what I would be expecting in this budget.
Thank you, Indranil. We've come to the end of this question and answer thing from my end. Just one last thing before we open the floor for Q&A. I'll go around the panel in the same order, and I'll ask you, what is your one single most important suggestion or expectation from the budget? If you can be brief and just one suggestion, please. Professor Goyal.
I think this combining reform with responding to the current situation. So I think transient short-term tax cuts to stimulate consumption would be a way of doing productive spending while you ramp up your investment expenditure. Thank you.
Nilkant?
Yeah, I think shifting the narrative to more medium term than year-on-year borrowing and, is it 20 basis points up, just 20 basis points down, the very fact that the markets are willing to live with, say, LIC IPO happening in March or in April is I think, a sign. And given that the objective right now is to get debt to GDP at a more sustainable level. That is the biggest fiscal priority for both state and central governments. I think shifting the narrative and shifting targets to a more 3-year debt to GDP than an annual fiscal deficit target would be a welcome move.
Thank you. Mr. Pathak?
The last budget had announced a digitalization, actually a formalization of informal worker scheme, which has been implemented in the e-Shram project, e-Shram. And over the last 120 days, nearly 23 crore people have already registered on that e-Shram. So you have informal workers converting into formalized workers. I'd love to see an urban employment program for those people who have registered under e-Shram. Easy to implement. Thank you.
Indranil, you'll have the last word.
Yeah. Implement. I hear what Nilkant said in terms of the capital expenditures not having met the pace that we expected it because files were not moving. But I have been doing budgets for almost 25 years now. And for significant number of years, irrespective of the pandemic, we have seen capital expenditures taking a beating compared to the revenue expenditure, which means there is a serious problem in terms of implementation of projects. The other thing I would really love in this budget is the asset monetization program. Yes, we have seen very clearly from the Niti Aayog the projects that they want to monetize, but we are still not clear about whether this monetized amounts actually go to the railways and the RECs and the PFCs, or they are a part of the budget, and how therefore the allocation in terms of future projects happens through these entities. That I think would be the core for me.
Thank you, each one of you, so much. Now we'll have the floor open for questions and answers. DG just wanted to check if we can read out of the chat, or you will allow people to ask questions.
No, I think best is to read from both in the chat as well as in the QA section. There are questions listed. You can list it out of those.
So the first question that I see is how inflation can be reduced, because okay, I think I'll let that pass. Okay. How can the government really increase its spending power, and how can inflation be reduced? I think any one of the panelists can choose to answer this.
Well, there is a short and a long way of increasing spending power. Short-term way is just to put more money in the hands of people, and that could also reduce inflation. So it's a double, like you cut fuel taxes, you are putting more money in people's hands, and you are reducing inflation. There was just one other point I wanted to make about the international tensions and the rise in inflation in US. And we saw the difference between Bernanke and Janet Yellen, their regimes. The taper took place in Bernanke. He just announced it as sort of guidance that we will be beginning the taper at such and such a time. But Janet Yellen, it was related to what is happening to inflation, to fuller employment, etc. So I think the Fed has learned that lesson. So more clear communication, you're moving from forward guidance towards data-driven guidance. And what you're doing is linked to data. Troubles, markets are able to digest it better. So that might reduce the kind of global volatility we see, which could also impact inflation. So, yeah, thank you.
There is a question from Mr. Shankar Narayanan, basically saying low labor participation, especially the decline in women participation rate, is a worrying trend for productivity as well as the economy. Do you think any changes that could be announced in the labor code to support an increase in women labor participation? So Dr. Goyal, I think you've spoken about it in the past, so maybe you can answer that.
Yeah, well, I think in India, we've always had low women participation. I mean, recently it is related to, I think, a lot of rural women shifting from the fields towards getting degrees and so on. And we see the data shows some rise in people in the tertiary sector, services, education, and so on, growth in jobs there while decrease in women working on the fields. So I think that is a good thing. It's part of a desirable transition in the labor market. In the US, you are seeing labor participation decline in women, partly because they have to take the brunt of children being at home and so on. But again, coming back to the Indian context, I think what we have learned, and we have an advantage in youth and digitization, outsourcing, this work from home enables a lot of skilled women to enter the workforce, and also women who are artisans making producers through self-help groups. So you're seeing a lot of increase there. I think that will naturally increase women's participation over time as we learn that more and more work can be done online and from home. It gives more flexibility to women. Thank you.
DG, if we have any questions, anybody wanting to ask questions, we can. Otherwise, I'll be just reading out in some random order. Yeah.
No, so Dr. Shukla, please go ahead, because the format right now we have for the conclave is that the participants can only post questions in the Q&A box and cannot ask.
Sure. So the next question, I think Neelkant and Mr. Pathak can probably answer. Construction and real estate are very important, and nearly 25% of global GDP of 100 trillion. In India, this is significantly lower. What specific initiatives do you think that the government can come up with this in this budget to set the trend for growth, and also from the private sector perspective, what are the barriers? So I think this is a very long question from Mr. Khurana, but if Neelkant and Mr. Pathak can probably attempt answering this.
Yeah, sure. So, you see, there is dwelling construction, which is largely private, though the government also has been working hard to get the affordable housing projects off the ground. And there's been some momentum, but I think the kind of success that we saw with Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Gramin has not appeared in the Pradhan Mantri Urban scheme. But the good thing is that there seems to be some cyclical upturn in the dwelling construction market, and what the government can try to do is speed up a few things. The first is financing. So one of the biggest problems with the NBFCs going under, or at least getting into financing troubles in 2018, or starting late 2018, was that under construction projects were not getting enough financing, and measures to address that bottleneck, because buyers clearly do not want to buy new houses, under construction houses, or at least there is some resistance. It's reducing slowly, but I think it can be sped up. Construction can be sped up if financing is eased. On the affordable housing side and on the pace at which supply can respond, I think the reduction in the approval time periods, one of the reasons why we have such extreme bull markets and then extreme and prolonged bear markets in housing, is that it takes 6 years to build, or 5 years to build a reasonably large housing project, whereas it should take a year and a half. And the biggest problem there is the whole plethora of approvals, some of them totally outdated. And these are things that I think the people in the government themselves are aware. It's just that these processes are not being changed. So if we can speed up the process without, of course, losing control of the path taken for dwelling construction, I think we could see some good pickup in the economy. On the infrastructure side, I wouldn't say that we are maxed out, and clearly I think the envelope can be stretched on the road side. So from 25 years back, not knowing how to build 50 kilometers of a 4-lane highway, we are now building 40 kilometers, 45 kilometers every day, right? So there's been significant capacity building in the road infrastructure creation. So construction equipment, construction companies, balance sheets, the supply of various materials, etc., etc. Similar scale up is needed in railways. So we should be spending 8 to 10 lakh crores, really speeding it up in terms of expenditure. We have come a long way from doing 50,000 crores of capex to 2.5 lakh crores of capex. But I think 2.5 lakh crores of capex is still too small, given the pace of change and the pace of investment that is needed. So we need to really scale up. And one of the biggest problems, from what I understand, is that the railways is used to executing 1 crore, 5 crore projects. In fact, someone in the ministry was explaining to me 3-4 years back that if we have to do 50,000 crores of capex, we do 1,005 crore projects. Whereas what perhaps they should do is 50,000 crore projects, right? Which are easier to monitor, easier to outsource. And I think that's just capacity building and process management in the railways. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's the direction in which we should head. And the reason I used roads as an example is that we have done it in the past. There was a time where we could not do 50 kilometers in a year. Now we do 50 kilometers a day. And I think something similar needs to be attempted in railways as well.
Mr. Pathak, you want to add anything?
Just one perspective that India's challenge in order to get to 5 trillion or to 10 trillion thereafter is to be moving out a lot of surplus labor from agriculture into manufacturing and services. And a whole lot of these unskilled people can only be absorbed in construction. And thereafter, they will skill themselves up and go into other more remunerative occupations. So construction, Mr. Hemant Khurana, you're absolutely right. We have to focus on construction. As far as the real estate sector is concerned, affordable housing is already in the list of infrastructure as defined by Government of India and has access to cheaper funds. In fact, affordable rental complexes are also in the definition of infrastructure. And in Bombay, the chawls were nothing but affordable housing for the textile workers. So real estate is going to generate construction. Infrastructure is going to generate construction. Two things I'd like to suggest. The first is, how can we reduce the cost of land and the cost of buildings? And we have a tech solution here called Swamitwa, which is that in the next 3 years, each and every immovable property in India, especially in cities, is going to have a unique ID number. And I hope and pray that that unique ID will be matched to an Aadhaar of the owner. So a lot of Benami properties will have distress selling, and therefore prices will go down. So that will help construction. The second I'd say is how can we focus on better managed cities? Because most construction is going to be in cities. And it's not just Mumbai, it's Thane, it's Kolhapur, it's Miraj, it's Nashik, Aurangabad. How can we make the capacity of city governments on par with the capacity of state governments today? Thank you.
I think we're running out of time. Maybe I'll combine just two questions very quickly, and if they can be answered. So a lot of questions on expectations from the budget in terms of what can it do for addressing the K-shaped recovery. And another interesting one doing the rounds, somebody's asked if stock markets are overpriced and fueling inequality, can we introduce a more rigorous wealth tax? So any of the panelists can answer that, and we'll probably end with that.
This is surely for Nilkant.
So I'll take the So I guess stock market. I think Nilesh Bhai is laughing. I think he should answer it. So on the wealth tax, I don't think anyone disagrees with the fact that there is wealth inequality as well as income inequality. And I must say that I'm less worried about incomes returning. So there is a lot of this debate on K-shaped recovery, and my God, things are so bad. They are very bad, but at least on the income recovery side, you just need to open up the economies, right? So if you see the job losses, they are for school teachers, they are for construction workers, they are people working in brick kilns. So if you open up the economy, you let the state government do their normal capex, demand for tiles, bricks, construction material goes up, equipment goes up, school teachers start getting jobs, the tempo walas carrying school kids to school start getting income. And so all of those jobs will then come back. And the problem we'll have to address is wealth inequality, right? Because for the last 2 years, there's been zero income, say if you were a tourist guide in Agra, and just to survive, you have shed assets or you've taken on liabilities just to survive. And I think repairing that is going to take time. So that problem is well acknowledged. I think wealth tax requires a very different level of state capacity. In fact, for most of this discussion, we've discussed lack of state capacity. So we should sometimes the medicine can be worse than the disease, and we should limit those excursions into the unknown.
Thank you, Nilkant. I think we come to an end. We have another session, very interesting one after this. And just wanted to end by saying that there's somebody called Arthur Motley who said, if you put all economists end to end, they would point in all directions, right? Fortunately for us, all our panelists have been talking about key things, which is coordination between the center and state, coordination between monetary and fiscal policy, and looking at the medium term or the long term capacity enhancement and things like that. So I'm glad we got these nuggets from them. Thank you, each one of you panelists, for your time. And back to you, DG.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Shukla. But I think, that one reason could be the Bombay Chamber platform, because we bring everyone together and make them point in the same direction. So thank you, Dr. Shukla, for moderating this session. And my sincere thanks to Professor Goyal, to Indranil, Mr. Pathak, and Mr. Mishra. Thank you very much for being here today. Anjali, would you want to say something before we introduce the next panel?
I have been listening in rapt attention, and I think it is nothing short of miraculous. And I think Bombay Chamber will absolutely take all credit for economists pointing in the same direction. I think what I heard today is so energizing and very positive. I think all our private sector specialist experts here, as well as public-private partnership, was glad to hear Shailesh talking about what happens to our blue and grey collar workers. eShram indeed is turning out to be a tremendous success, and we are hoping that by linking it to skilling and to jobs, we can actually complete the full arc. The focus on infrastructure development at the very local level, getting water into taps for our rural villages, for our rural populations, agri reform. I was glad to hear there was not that much discussion, frankly, about what can the state do necessarily in terms of SOPs, but more in terms of what we can do together on the journey to economic growth and progress. So thank you so much, everyone. It has been a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot, as I'm sure all our participants have as well, and I'm looking forward to the next session. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And for the next session, we have our moderator, Mr. Nilesh Shah, Senior Vice President and Chair, Banking, Finance and Capital Markets of Bombay Chamber, and also President and Managing Director, as all of you know, of Kotak Mahindra Asset Management Company. Along with them, panel members, Rajiv Anand, Deputy Managing Director, Axis Bank, Rajiv Sabharwal, CEO and Managing Director, Tata Capital, Vinay Tonse, MD and CEO, SBI Mutual Fund, and Nitya Ishwaran, MD, Multiples Alternate Asset Management. So welcome, and over to you, Nilesh Bhai.
Thank you, Sandeep. Anjali Bansal, President, Bombay Chamber, past presidents and office bearers of Bombay Chamber, and ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a privilege for me to chair this panel, where I have an experienced banker, a mutual fund CEO, a private equity investor, and NBFC. If you want to create 5 trillion and beyond GDP, you need to finance it. And clearly, you can't get better inputs than this panel on how to finance $5 trillion GDP. Let me start with Rajiv Anand first. Recently, government has invited feedback from various organizations about the vision for India in its centenary 2047. What should be the building block for India to aim for in 2047? And from a banking sector point of view, what will be your wish list?
Thank you, Nilesh Bhai. I think I'm not the kind of visionary that our Prime Minister is think through into 2047. But I think there are some basics that we need to put in place. I think infrastructure spend. I mean, we had a whole bunch of economists talk about the fact that infrastructure spend needs in this country. Two is job creation needs to happen. And I think as you think about the other side of the economy, the consumption economy, the fact that a large percentage of the small businesses, the urban poor, the micro MSMEs have been deeply impacted through COVID. And I think it will take a fair amount of time to get these people out of where they are today. And I think it is critical for us, therefore, to be able to spend energies on creating that the MSME sector. The other aspect is perhaps one should think about geopolitics. I think we are at an inflection point from a geopolitical perspective, and the world is in a sense looking at us to be able to bridge some of the friction that has gotten created across the world, and we are in a fantastic position in that sense to be able to benefit from this opportunity that is being presented to us at this point in time. And finally, I think over the last 10 years, we've created fantastic digital infrastructure in this country. And unlike the problem that many of the other countries have, it is public infrastructure that we have created, not monopolies. And I think it has significantly transformed the way that we live on a day-to-day basis. And I think we should just continue to go down this path of creating public digital infrastructure for us to create a better tomorrow for our people. I think from a banking and financial services perspective, we've gone through a fair amount of bother over the last 5-7 years. I think balance sheets are well capitalized, and I think the ability of the banking system now to be able to meet the needs and aspirations of this country, I think, have become much better. And we're hoping that will continue as we go forward. We're also seeing a lot of new activity within the financial services sector, the creation of InvITs, REITs, and new instruments and new capital, coming into this country. And I think we should wholeheartedly support that as we go forward, because I think ultimately domestic savings are not going to be enough to take us to first $5 trillion and $10 trillion economy, and so on and so forth as we go forward. Let's look at regulations. Let's ensure that we are very, very serious about ease of doing business, both domestically and globally. And therefore, if we're able to sort of think about all these, I think our ability to get to our aspirations of 2047 become relatively less aspirational to my mind, Nilesh.
Thank you, Rajiv. Now to Rajiv Sabharwal. With Jan Dhan, we have ensured that banking has reached to the every nook and corner of India, to every citizen. But unfortunately, in terms of providing credit facility, we have many unbanked enterprises or individuals. So what will be your suggestion? Because if we have to really create 5 trillion and beyond GDP, we need to ensure that organized financing reaches every nook and corner, just like Jan Dhan.
Yeah. No, thanks, Nilesh. I think if you want single point answer to that, it's more competition. How do we allow more players to be there in the industry so that they can take care of more requirements? In the sense that if you've seen it in your own industry, you've been a part of this industry for so long, you've seen the era when there were only a few players, less than 5 players in the industry. And how did growth happen in that industry? And how did it transform when more players came into the industry? Obviously, you need to have guardrails on net worth and so on and so forth, and right checks and balances. But I think the country needs far many more players in the financing industry, both from the banking side. Probably, if you look at today's banking system, you'll find it tough to count more than 5 very active banks. So can we make these 5 as at least 20? And if you start counting very active NBFCs, you won't find more than 6 or 7. So how do you get at least 30, 40 more active NBFCs? So I think competition is one thing which will, enable this to happen. And if there is one thing we need to do to, move in that direction, probably that's one thing to pick up, I would say. Just one.
Continuing.
Just one point on the previous thing. About the long-term thing. Though Rajiv answered, I wanted to add 1 or 2 points to it. One is this whole thing about, how do we decrease the income disparity? In this country, doesn't mean that we need to take income away from the rich, but how do we make the rest of the people earn much more? And there are a lot of things which can be done in that direction. So that's one direction we have to move towards, so that we can increase the earning power of those people. And second thing, which this really worries me, if you don't address this really worries me for the future. And the second thing is, how do we create better dispute resolution mechanisms, both international and national? These two things are, because somewhere freedom and rule of law go together, and that's very, very important for our economy to flourish. So these two aspects will be very, very important if we want to look at a more stable 2047 and a much stronger India in 2047.
Thank you, Rajiv. Coming to Vinay Bhai, today one problem which we are facing is that many a times debt is available for worthy borrowers. They have problem of plenty, but equity is not available, and mutual funds do play an important role in providing equity capital. What will be your wish list for 2047 centenary India? And how do we bridge this gap of providing equity capital? Vinay Bhai, you are on mute.
Thank you, Nilesh Bhai, and also a good evening to the office bearers of Bombay Chambers and my fellow panelists. I also happen to be a banker. Some of you may be aware, I come from the State Bank of India on deputation here, and I cannot but speak about the role of intermediaries. Right? And when we talk about 2047, the first thought that comes to my mind is, at that point of time, we will no longer be calling ourselves as an emerging economy. It will be a fully developed economy. And this is my vision. That's the vision in my mind when I give my thoughts on how we can be building blocks, and also particularly move towards equity. Intermediaries, eventually, I think we have to complement the role of the government, I would say, in playing in many cases, they are also playing the role of an intermediary, which is not really the role I would feel. And we have to, the free market players have to, as we are doing now, I think this role becomes much more serious and important. We supplement the role of the government in the economic development. And this is where mutual funds particularly would come. We are today a nation where we still find excess sources in some places. You're talking about debt and deficiency and need for capital. I think that's where the mutual funds role also will come in. I do not fully agree that equities are not attracting capital today. Over the last few years, I mean, both of us are in the same industry today. We know very well that increasingly fund flow has started coming in. But one thing I must mention here is that though the regulators have been playing a very strong role in bringing stability to the capital markets, I think their role is a little more, and we all have to help towards that also, that there is stability. Now, when one is talking about why doesn't equity attract a lot of capital today, it's because of the nature of savers and nature of savings. If we can bring in more stability, and like we see the markets today, who would actually put in their hard-earned money into such markets? I mean, if you bring some sort of stability as the capital market regulators have been, I think that goes a long way in bringing in more and more capital. And mutual funds definitely have and I am very clear about my role. Eventually, in the mutual fund industry, we have been talking about going into that Bharat part, right? That will be a very strong building block for the 2047 vision which India has for itself. India is fairly well into equity investments now. Eventually, we have to get access, which was one of the pillars of financial inclusion, if we may recall, giving access to those remote areas to capital markets. I think that's where we play a strong role, and this will be through increasing digitalization. I hope that answers to some extent this question of how we can be building blocks.
Thank you, Vinay. Coming over to the private equity and venture capital's exciting world, Nitya, what will be your wish list for 2047 Centenary India? And can the Silicon Valley of India be as big and as prosperous as Silicon Valley of US?
Yeah, I mean, building on what Vinay said, right? What will we be in 2047? Some exciting. I was spending the last few minutes of thinking of numbers. We are a $3.5 trillion GDP today. What will we be 25 years hence? We'd probably be in the range of 25 to 30 trillion, nominal GDP. That's a very big number. We will definitely be in the top 3, economy. And I was wondering what will be our market cap at that time, probably 30, 40 trillion. And if I put that in context of PEVC, I mean, today PEVC last 2 years has put in capital of about 125 billion into India. That itself, the absorption rate has gone up very steeply as compared to the last 5 years. And as an industry, we feel for this 3.5 to 25 trillion journey, we have to increase this absorption to maybe 3 to 5% of our GDP can come in through PEVC. If you put those numbers, they're staggering. I mean, that means in 2047, we will be absorbing close to $1 trillion of PEVC. And how do we make that happen? And we will have we already know we have 80 plus unicorns now, and we are talking about decacorns, obviously. So we'll have PEVC playing a role not only in private companies but owning a lot of public companies as well. And we'll get to more, rather than talking about specific regulations, one of the things we have been engaging with the government with is to look at it comprehensively, rather than saying, I will change some IRDA regulation, some SEBI regulation, some competition commission regulation, each of which this industry now has started hitting. So how do you make a more comprehensive view of this regulation and really take this to the next level to attract this kind of capital? I mean, we are building from this 60 billion absorption to $1 trillion. That's a tremendous journey over 25 years that we need to take. And I think we're getting some very good vibes from the government. It's been very supportive, and we do hope that soon we will see some kind of an initiative to overhaul, to kind of look at these regulations comprehensively from a PEVC industry perspective. Just switching gears, another point is to look at what are the sectors, right? As we think of India to 2047, what will be those sectors? Of course, tech will continue to play a role, but beyond that, I really want to call out 3 sectors where we haven't seen much change yet. More PEVC money has to flow in there. I would say agriculture. There's a lot to happen in terms of bringing efficiency, improving market linkages, building in technology there. Manufacturing. We have all heard the story of how our manufacturing sector is lagging as compared to the GDP. And there have been some recent good efforts from the government on the PLI side, as well as pushing up exports. I think we can play a very big, very, very big role there. And the third is on climate change. We have made some lofty, targets that the government has put, worthy targets to achieve in the COP26. And that's going to spur a whole lot of investments, whether it's in renewables, EV, green material. I think directing some of this, PE money into some of these sectors, other than, of course, the continued absorption by our enterprise technology and consumer technology sectors, which will continue to flow. will be very, very key. Those would be my couple of points on 2047.
Thank you, Nitya. Now, obviously, the journey from here to 2047 will have its own challenges, but probably none of the challenges will be as big as COVID-19, which we witnessed last year. So coming to Rajiv, you in the banking system, when COVID came and hit, what did you observe in financing various businesses, and what changes you made to cope up with that?
I think in when COVID hit, none of us had a playbook on how to deal with this. Not the banks, not not corporate India. But I think as you look back over the last 2.5 odd years, the resilience and adaptability of corporate India to this new reality has been phenomenal. Nobody has really complained that, except for that brief period right at the beginning when Maruti didn't sell even a single car in a month. Other than that, I mean, the way that industries bounce back, people bounce back, I think is I think a great testimony to the adaptability and resilience of corporate India. Obviously, the first thing that all of us did was to ensure that our people were safe. Two was it was about ensuring that we are now able to work from home. And so for banks like us, we are now able to even deal foreign exchange transactions unheard of. I mean, I have been in treasuries for 20 odd years. The fact that you could put an FX transaction through sitting on your sofa at home was unthinkable. But those are the, I mean, if you got to do it, you got to do it kind of scenarios that we are in at this point in time. And we've managed quite comfortably. We've been able to manage operational risk on one side and be able to serve our customers on the other side. Second is digital adoption has been phenomenal. And I think this is not a journey that has started over the last few years, but I think all the hard work that we've done in terms of creating digital infrastructure, digital technology, and I think we should certainly call out the telecom companies to have been able to create this infrastructure has helped us ensure that we are able to serve our customers who are not able to come to the branch, on the mobile app, for example. So I think what we've been able to do to change the way that we've been working has been phenomenal. And I think it's also taught us that this is the new reality. We have in Axis Bank, we have now moved to a permanent hybrid model, where our large offices, we are now permanently saying that we will do a hybrid model of, where people will come 2 days or 3 days. I can't see anytime soon where we will have 100% of our people in our offices. On the other side, we've also ensured that our balance sheet is watertight. We've raised capital during this period. We've increased our reserves. We've relooked at our underwriting standards, both on retail and wholesale. And as things have improved, we've to that extent loosened underwriting standards as well. And I think as we go out, I won't say go out of the pandemic, but at least into the next phase of the pandemic, what I can assure you is that most of the large banks in India are now well capitalized. They have adequate buffers in case we go through another situation, and are hungry and ready to grow and support the large aspirations that we have here in India.
Thanks, Rajiv. The adaptability and acceptance of change has been phenomenal. Rajiv Sabharwal, in the NBFC sector, how did you cope up with the challenges on the lending side, and what will be the good practices experience worth sharing with this audience?
Nilesh, very much similar to what Rajiv mentioned. In terms of the biggest priority was at that point of time taking care of the employees and ensuring that everybody remains safe. I think the empathy levels definitely went up during that period, and that's good, and that's going to remain there permanently. The other thing was the adoption of digital. While everything was moving at a particular pace on the digital side, but I think the pandemic really hastened the pace of digital adoption. New products, I would say the new products which we launched during that period of 6 months once the pandemic started were probably more than what we had launched in the last 3 years. So that's how the pace of development went up. And even the adoption by the front-end channels, where we used to struggle and we used to keep telling them, adopt more and more of this. We didn't have to really convince them. All of that happened during that period. The other thing is that we all got much more conscious of the costs which we incur for everything. So there was a fair amount of belt tightening happened initially, and that in a way has continued during that period. Post that, all of us have become more conscious about productivity. The same salespeople who used to ask for more people at one point of time, today, do far more analysis today than before. So as an organization also, you move towards a more productive, a more cost conscious organization. The other is, I think, the low touch model, which something which we all wanted, and we were in a way expanding our customer service areas in the branches. All of that took a beating, and the low touch model fell into place, and customers were happy to adopt that too. So these were some of the big things which happened. Another one thing which got adopted in a big way was e-learning. Something which again was moving at a particular pace, but not at the pace at which we wanted. All of that actually transformed during this period.
Thanks, Rajiv. In mutual fund, the pandemic really created some sort of crisis of confidence, with NAVs falling and one of the mutual fund winding down schemes. And from there, to see kind of inflows, record inflows, which mutual funds are receiving. So Vinay, how did the turnaround occur? You are the largest mutual fund in the country. What did you do to gain back investors' confidence?
Yeah, interesting question, Nilesh. I'll just take a minute off to share how actually I started COVID. The first 4 months of COVID, I was in the State Bank of India. I was managing a fairly large circle for the bank there in southern India, with about 1,500 branches and about 15,000 people. There, the experience was something very similar as to both our Rajiv friends have mentioned, right? Initially take care of the health of our staff and then ensure that the customers get into the digitalization part. Adoption was very, very smooth, except for the first month or so. Now, I came to Mumbai to head this SBI mutual funds. I was a COVID CEO. I mean, if I may call that. I didn't have the opportunity to meet my staff here. We were working with a very skeletal sort of a structure. Only the very important positions were coming in. Even by the time I came in, all the dealing was happening out of homes. The work from home structure was very, very fine. But surprisingly, I found that everything was in place. Business continuity wise, there was absolutely no problem. And our IT infrastructure, digital infrastructure was so strong. And the most surprising thing to me was all my anxieties about how to regain the customer confidence was absolutely belied, because there was no crisis at all in confidence. This is what my observation was, be it in distributors, be it in investors, be it in our own staff. In fact, if I may look at it from this particular angle, though it was a very sad development to happen for the globe, then for our industry particularly, I think there was a shift in perspective from, as far as wasteful expenditure came down, because opportunities to spend came down quite drastically. Plus, there was a shift in the perception of people towards the need for savings and what do I do with my savings? How do I invest it well? I think this ensured that the mutual fund industry went from strength to strength. And though you mentioned that there was a period when the market saw a low, that was April. But after that, even by July, we had seen very, very strong pointers towards the markets going up, and we saw that the markets reached 62,000 levels. Of course, today we are at around 57, 58, but then that is the level we reached. Secondly, again, I agree with our friends there when they said that whatever happened only hasn't the pace which would otherwise have taken maybe the next few years, particularly on the digitalization front. The adoption was so smooth, so superb. We never had any issue of, particularly as an outsider, I used to think that when someone wants to invest, they would like to see me physically, they would like to take my advice physically. This was not the case. People got so quickly used to digital modes, even on telephone, and this was the wonderful change which I saw. I think that's about my thoughts for now.
Thanks, Vinay. Pandemic actually ended up becoming supportive to PE and VC industry. The pace of investments and pace of transactions went multifold. So, Nitya, what are the learnings for PE VC industry? How did they evolve and adopted and took advantage of the opportunity available?
Yeah, I'll speak on two things. One is, as you rightly said, the advantage of PE VC is we work on a portfolio, and that portfolio has exposures across industries. So overall, as we looked at our portfolio, there were a few sectors which were retail oriented sectors, whether they are apparel industry, multiplexes, whatever else on the retail side, which got impacted. And we had other parts of our portfolio which were digitally led, whether they were SaaS companies, consumer tech, which got positively impacted. So overall, I would say as an industry and as multiples itself, it didn't turn out as bad as we thought. In fact, you rightly said it turned out pretty well. But coming to, that's a very narrow view. I mean, we live our lives through the lives of our portfolio companies most of the time. So where did we start off in April 2020? Our first was fear, right? None of us knew what this pandemic was and how it will affect all our companies. So the first call we took was to say, let's just keep $100 million as capital support, which our portfolio companies would need. And just to give you a perspective, that's 100 million on a 550 million fund that we had. So it was a pretty large proportion of the original invested capital that we went in with, to say maybe we have to create this pool, and in India you have to survive to thrive. So we have to see our companies through this period. But as Rajiv Anand mentioned, the resilience was very, very good. So today, when we sit back and see out of that 100 million pool that we created, we hardly used less than 20 million as confidence capital to go in and support some of our worst affected companies at that time. Decisions around tough decisions actually became easier in many of these companies. And there's a saying which says never waste a crisis. So some of the tougher decisions on cost cutting, less productive businesses, kind of shutting them down, which in a BAU, it may have been very difficult to make those decisions because people are involved. The flip side of that is the tougher aspect, impact it has had on employment, people. That's as an economy and as people, I think that is regrettable because you had to shed people to survive, the rest of the company. And while a humane view was taken in terms of period given and so on and so forth, nevertheless, it would have cost the economy a bit. Tech adoption, we could see from the eyes of our SaaS companies, not just the other companies adopting it, but the business of our SaaS companies really, moved up, and you could see that tech adoption was moving in. So I would say, other than some of the retail companies which did not get relief in the overall scheme of things, from our financial services sector in the initial part, you did get some relief, and that helped. I would say the first 6 months of moratorium, which the RBI and the government put in, was helpful because you didn't want to create a crisis when already a crisis was happening on the pandemic side. Or the ECLGS and the other schemes that came in gave that little bit of support as you try to figure out what to do. And I would say now, it's a wonderful time for PE/VC investors because you could have seen the companies who have survived the crisis. It's like a fire test. And the companies which come out of that are really stronger, and it's a great time to then back them. So that was some of our experiences through the COVID.
Thanks, Nitya. If we want to build a $5 trillion GDP, there are some weak points in Indian economy which we need to manage. MSME gives more than half of exports, majority of employment. And Rajiv, you mentioned that they are in some sort of weak situation. What steps government, budget, or outside of budget can be taken to support MSME so that they start contributing towards this $5 trillion GDP journey?
So I think this is an absolutely important question, Nilesh. And as we think about our country, if we don't want to create a nation of delivery boys and drivers and liftmen, but actually, productive people who can run, even if it means small businesses, this part of the economy is super, super critical from a job creation perspective and creating economic entities, so to speak. 6.3, 6.4 crore MSMEs are there in this country, but unfortunately, almost 97, 98% of those are micro. But the balance 1%, the kind of people that we bank are actually, thriving. Access Capital's head of research actually did a road trip across the country, and he came back very, very bullish about the small and medium part of the MSMEs, and I think we need to continue to ensure that they grow and they are getting their ability to to get financing, etc. is not a problem. The problem really is in the micro segment. It's the unorganized, unorganized informal sector. Some of these, as the country becomes more and more formal, many of these entities are what I would call tax arbitrage entities, and thanks to GST and things like that, that arbitrage is gone, and so therefore their reason to exist no longer is there, and so therefore many of those entities will probably collapse. But I think it is very important for us to ensure that micro segment begins to grow. I think the damage that we've seen through the pandemic has been tremendous. And as banks, what we are really doing is to, what is really improved is we are moving, although, at a very slow pace, moving away from lending against collateral to many of these entities. And we are beginning to learn to lend, towards cash flows, because the ability of banks to now better understand many of these entities who may not have the formal, accounting infrastructure, is beginning to improve thanks to some of the data that is now available. But I think it's a two-way process. I think the micro segments also need to formalize, need to start paying taxes, need to use more digital transactions for them to be able to be bankable. And I think so. There is a lot that the government is doing. There's a lot that the banks are doing, but I think there is some onus on the micro segment as well, to formalize. Because otherwise they will get left behind, or in many cases will need to shut down as well. And to me, in terms of the way that the last 10 to 15 years has been about retail finance in this country, I think if we get it right over the next 10 to 15 years is about MSME financing in this country. And I think it's a huge opportunity as we think about it. And I don't think we can get it wrong. Because if we want to create jobs, if we want to get that demographic dividend that we talk about, and if we don't want to create a nation of drivers and liftmen and delivery boys, this piece is super critical.
Thanks, Rajiv. The next weak spot in the economy is consumption. While trade, agriculture, private investments, and government spending are above pre-pandemic level, consumption unfortunately continues to remain below pandemic level. Rajiv Sabharwal, what can we do to support consumption in budget as well as outside of budget?
I think first of all, we should stop all this concept of forced lockdowns with different states coming and taking decisions which are very different. So somewhere leaving it to the business owners, individuals and others to decide whether they need a lockdown or whether they need to stay at home or come to office. That choice should be left to them rather than anything, which is state enforced. A lot of problem gets created because of that. The second, I think we all know that the country needs more jobs. While in the process of getting efficient or becoming more productive, a lot of people lost jobs during the pandemic and they have not got them back. And a lot of people saw cut in their salaries and income levels, and they have not come back to those levels. I do get a lot of mails from our own customers saying, how they've been impacted and so on. So we have to get more jobs in. What do we need to do to reskill people? What do we need to do to help small businesses become more digitally savvy? And how do we create funds for them to move in that direction is extremely important. The other thing which we all know, which is very critical for our nation, is to put more money behind education and healthcare. This is extremely important. Even the consciousness about insurance, both life and health, is extremely, again, important. And if the state needs to support or the employers need to support this, then it will be extremely helpful. Even if a part of the money from PF can be used to ensure a mandatory health insurance and life insurance, I can tell you lifestyles of a lot of families would be very different, post, even if they face the pandemic hit. These things are very critical. The other is this whole concept of overdues or payments not reaching MSMEs on time. This is, while a lot of work has happened, but I can tell you the situation still is grave on the ground, and we need to make things happen there. And the last is your support on support which the MSMEs need. Besides this, what I mentioned in terms of faster payment for their bills or digital support to make their businesses become more e-friendly, I think they also need demand support. The big are becoming bigger and the smaller ones are not there to live their life. So how do we provide demand support? And it could be in different forms. But we need to get this MSME sector alive back. This was the biggest job creator for us, and we can't let it fall.
Thanks, Rajiv. Apart from consumption and MSME, the third thing, which is, probably in the weaker spot, is availability of capital for entrepreneurs. Today, our savings remain tilted towards physical assets like real estate and gold. It has started moving towards financial assets, but a lot has to be done. So Vinay bhai, what steps can be taken for improving ease of doing investment, for increasing participation in financial assets so that domestic entrepreneurs will have domestic capital available?
Yeah. Before I get into this directly, I was very eagerly listening to what our friends were talking about the employment part. In fact, I was just thinking that they were talking more about the MSME sector creating employment. I was thinking, because this is I'm just taking over from what we have been discussing in some of our mutual fund industry meetings also. There's a huge scope available for us, apart from the channelization that happens indirectly creating employment, directly. Because in the next 20-25 years, I see at least an 8x or 10x growth in the mutual fund industry. And this would need a huge army of distributors, relationship managers across not only the urban areas, the metro areas. I'm even talking about the B30, the unbanked sort of areas. This itself is going to create a huge employment opportunity going forward. Now, I come to this particular question of financialization of savings. Yes, there is a very, very strong move that has been happening towards shifting out of physical assets. And I think now our investors, the savers, realize that there's more sense in getting into the financialization aspect, financial savings. And we are seeing the inflows that are coming in. Now we need to see how we can make that easier. And this is one of the aspects I was talking about, having more and more advisors across regions of India. Particular target which we should be making is the Bharat part of it. I think that is where we are going to get a huge inflow of money which is available there. And this should be getting into the financialization part of savings and investment. And this is also where the digitalization part has to be coming in. Because when we talk about the B30, we are talking about the necessity for lowering our costs. I think, and that is only going to come from the digitalization. And we are very strongly moving towards this. And with the help of the fintechs which are coming in, I think we talk about competition most of the times. How do you look at them as competition? But I would only look at them, maybe a cliche I'm using, but then I think we should use them as collaborators. And through them, if we can access all the B30 and B100, I think that is where we are going to get this from. That makes life much, much easier for all the players involved towards whatever vision we have in mind.
Thanks, Vinay. Nitya, we missed industrial revolution and paid the price for next 200 years. Now there is Web3, digital disruption, decentralization, everything coming up. What steps India should take to ensure that we are on top of it rather than witness passing by like industrial revolution? And with that sector coming up, can it provide employment? Can it provide consumption boom? Can it support the growth of the economy beyond 5 trillion?
Yeah, Web3 is it's a new phenomenon. Everybody is going to try and understand that. I'm glad we didn't miss Web 2 too much. We are seeing the advantages of Web 2, definitely moving from desktop to mobile and all the startups and unicorns that we have come here. I don't profess to be any expert of Web3, but whatever little I have understood is, what you mentioned. One is the power moving from centralized platforms, regulators, large institutions down to to people, which is through the blockchain that so your user control of data and user control of transactions increases. But even more people are talking about the creator economy, and we are seeing a little bit of that already playing out, where all of us and more the youngsters will be the IP creators, and they'll be able to monetize their IP as well. So Rajiv Anand spoke about, are we creating a country of delivery boys and and so on, but we'll probably end up creating a country of creators as well as we go along this path. And when we think of that, it's exciting because these are all micro entrepreneurs in a way, right? Who are influencers today, what we call them as influencers on platform, but will be content creators. And we'll need to find ways of giving them a housing loan, figuring out several other things in the real world that we have to support. But too difficult to put all of that to say, I don't think we'll miss it. We are in a good place just from the availability of capital, talent, innovation that we're playing here. But I'd like to call out 2-3 things that we need to do to keep this momentum going. We need to think of our founders and entrepreneurs and how we improve what we call ease of doing business for our entrepreneurs as well, because they are the ones who are going to take us into Web3 and beyond and make sure India is there. So here are a couple of things which we can actually deal with immediately is on ESOPs. ESOPs is the way we are going to create wealth for teams and founders. And while we think of founders in the generic way of promoters, and that's how India has always been thinking of founders, and hence we have these norms of saying only startup founders can get ESOPs. Once the particular size is crossed, you can't give ESOPs. And that's becoming a big bottleneck for scaling up, for all these innovative companies which are scaling up. So a relook at some of those to say, how we can continue to support founders building companies who are $10 billion, $20 billion, maybe $100 billion. We're seeing some of our companies reaching there and continuing to create wealth along that journey, through that, without worrying about how will I get paid in all of this, but through getting the ESOPs, because they continue to be called promoters, but yet get ESOPs. I think we have to solve this, change the mindset of founders versus promoters. And of course, in ESOPs, we also have the, the taxation problem. We've all been speaking about this talent migration, which we are all seeing happening. And with ESOPs, the younger companies can hope to retain the talent, but we have rules which require, the difference between fair value and issue price, to be taxed when you actually exercise the ESOP, much before you monetizing the ESOP. And that can create a huge burden for people who are, kind of working there. So somewhere a little bit of rethink on how we are going to keep this founder economy going for us so that we don't miss the, the Web3, thing which will come. The second is we have, we are good at consumer tech, application-based tech. Can we also invest some money into deep tech? India is still not known into deep tech. And I think there we have to galvanize some of our world-class institutions as well and fund them. I mean, whether it's through the CSR budgets, government allocations, whichever way, allowing some of the deep tech ideas to come out of our institutions will scale us up to the next level into that journey towards 2047. I think the third would be, now founders are creating not just India-centric companies, but their ambitions are global. So a lot of companies from India will go into Southeast Asia, will go into US. We're seeing edtech companies, actually, I mean, it's amazing. We would have never thought of it even 10 years back. People are saying, I will conquer the Indian market, but I'll also take my company global. And what are we doing to enable that? Would be and we don't want companies offshoring, because that will be a loss to India. That will be a loss to employment in India. That will be a loss to tax in India, and so on. So what is it that the government can do in terms of regulations to keep the companies headquartered here and yet allow them to grow into being multinationals? I think these 2-3 we need to solve early in this journey over the next 10-15 years to continue to reap the benefits of Web 2 into Web 3 and beyond.
Thanks, Nitya. Rajiv Sabharwal, you mentioned about increasing number of players in the financial services system. So let me ask you a contentious question. Should corporate be allowed into banking?
See, there is this huge talk about, banks, challenges occur in NBFCs only and challenges don't occur in banks. We have seen good performing NBFCs and bad performing NBFCs. We have had good performing banks and not good performing banks. It's all about governance structure around that and how the board works rather than the formal entity. My view on whether it is a corporate, whether it's an entrepreneur, or whether it's a financial services player, it is all about governance at the board level. It's about people, the seniors in that organization, that determines whether that organization will sustain for 100 years and will create benefits for the economy. So according to me, it is not about corporates or non-corporates. It's about good governance. There should be rewards for good governance and severe penalties for poor governance. And if we can move on speed, with speed on that front, then I don't think so we need to, bar anyone or welcome anyone. What is very important is to have a more safer system. If you would, Nilesh, even from the you've seen life within Kotak and before Kotak. And you've seen how long does it take to create a brand of trust. It takes time. And we need large banks now. We need them 25 years later also, but we need them now also. So you need names of trust, which inspire trust in consumers to be present in the financial services space. You can decide the method of getting them, but that is what you need.
Thanks, Rajiv. That was indeed a brilliant answer. It's institutions which matter and not individuals. Now I request Anjali to ask her question.
Thank you, Nilesh. And what a fascinating discussion here. I'm going to put out a couple of points and request anyone to respond really. Rajiv, Anand spoke about public digital infrastructure, which in my view is actually one of the singular innovations that has come out of India, is the creation of public digital assets. Whether it is Aadhaar with 1.4 billion people, with a unique biometric ID, it gives them the dignity of identity, or the UPI system, which has enabled seamless one-click payment, anyone to anyone. I don't think there's anywhere in the world. The way we've been able to handle COVID in some ways with our tracking, tracing through COVID and vaccine management. So there's a lot that is going on. Access, of course, is a supporter of open network for digital commerce. I heard a lot of conversation about MSMEs. So I'm going to put this out. How can we accelerate in some ways, take the India stack and make it opportunity to take the India stack and make it a global stack, one. Two is accelerate the adoption. And one of the advantages, of course, of COVID has been the acceleration of digital adoption in segments that were earlier slow to adopt, whether it was in healthcare and education or in MSMEs. But what can we do to maximize utilization of these public digital assets getting created, whether in health or in education or in ONDC, the Open Network for Digital Commerce? So we'll welcome thoughts from the very knowledgeable group here. And then I have one more question, Nilesh, if you will permit after that.
Definitely.
So let me try to answer that, Anjali. First and foremost, I'm not a great fan of sort of globalizing some of this infrastructure. We have enough problems of our own to solve for here in this country, not today or tomorrow, but certainly till, as Nilesh put it, till 2047, and then we'll worry about the new problems that will come up in 2047. So I think it is really we need to use. I think we've created this infrastructure. There are multiple use cases that have got created. And I think thousands of use cases will get created as we go forward. We've seen a lot of stuff being used in particularly in payments to some degree. In lending, we're now seeing utilization of that in healthcare. And I think, as you keep going deeper and deeper into this country, the ability to utilize this public infrastructure is going to build a better tomorrow. Because I think one of the things that we've been able to do as well is to put a mobile phone in everybody's hand. And to be able to therefore use that to improve the lives of our people is a huge opportunity for for entrepreneurs, for people who are willing to be passionate about this. And as Nitya said, I think the ability to raise money for ideas like this, I think, has been demonstrated over the last few years. The ability to raise money for good ideas is not a problem at all. And so therefore, let's focus on continue to develop this public infrastructure. But to my mind, I think let's use it for the huge problems that we have in this country to build a better tomorrow for our people.
Anjali, just to add, we are seeing a lot of innovation around this from the startups. So you do have a lot of business models which are digitizing micro businesses, and the most interesting thing is, right, even the single entrepreneur who comes, your bhajiwala, knows how to use Paytm or any other such Google Pay or any other such thing, right? But to move it to the next level of maintaining records and moving in. So I think some of the things, just to add on to what Rajiv said, you do have agencies like SIDBI or or NIIF, people who are directing investments into some of these areas. One thought could be to have more directed investment into innovative companies. who are really doing this in a big
I'm not
way.
sure there is dearth of capital, Nitya, to be honest. I think the last 2 years have been prolific for everyone in VC. All our companies have done well. And in fact, we talked a little bit about, I'm a little bit less worried about what happens to our youth, because I think our youth is finding amazing entrepreneurial avenues. The kinds of startups we are starting to see now at the seed stage are coming out of tier 2, tier 3. There is definitely work to be done with MSMEs and making sure they don't get left out of the net. But it's a golden decade ahead really for Indian entrepreneurship with our technology networks, our the biggest digital data network in the world, lowest cost of data, amazing talent, ideas in a large market, plus the public digital assets getting created. Can I turn the group to a question of, I'm just going back to the 4 mission pillars of the chamber. We talk about inclusive growth, we talk about sustainable growth, ease of doing business, as well as digitization and innovation. So as we think about sustainability, and given that India really is a very important player in achieving global climate goals and climate action, how do you as financiers see the participation of our mainstream financial ecosystem? So we are starting to see a lot of stuff happen now in climate tech, for example, but mainstream financial ecosystem, how do you see that contributing to creating a more climate and sustainable, responsible business model across the board? So integrated business models for climate action and sustainability. Could be in EVs, could be in agriculture, could be anywhere.
See, this noise, Anjali has been, you've also seen it closely as this whole ESG noise, which is, I would call it a good noise, which has been created by global capital providers and has been building up, and it's really built up to a fantastic position now where we are. It's not just a need to have, I need to tick the box to get this capital in, but more of saying it's an opportunity, and it's an important risk management tool as well. So somewhere this group, which represents capital providers, are going to play a super important kind of a role there.
That's my question, right, Nitya? I mean, people like us are playing the role. I want to ask large banks, large NBFCs, large asset managers, are you actually moving capital to ESG responsible companies on the public side? And how do you think about supporting integrated business models? Because that's where the rubber hits the road, right? When you have to make CapEx decisions and you say, okay, I'll take a longer break even. So really straight question to the banks, the asset managers, and the NBFCs and the lenders here.
Anjali, absolutely. Unlike let's say the manufacturing entities, our own creation of a carbon footprint is relatively small. Branches, electricity, etc. But it really comes from the lending side of our business. And in Access, we've already committed to increase lending to green sectors by 30,000 crores over the next 5 years, which is a big leap for us. Similarly, we've also created a pool for affordable housing. We are also supporting EV two-wheelers and four-wheelers. I think there's a 50 basis points discount that we're giving on the rates of interest. But we've also, more importantly, we've also embedded ESG into our risk management framework, because it is not just about, yes, we want to create a better planet and we want to, support the promises and ambitions of the country, etc. But I think it's also now become a risk management issue, because companies that are not able to meet or not committed to meet ESG norms are not going to get money. And this is increasingly becoming a conversation at our board level of what exactly are you doing on reducing, for example, your exposures to coal, to thermal, etc. And at one level, yes, that's happening. But I think, we are also looking at this not as a knee jerk saying everything coal is bad and everything solar is good. I think it is about it's about, especially in countries like ours, and we've got to do what is right for our country. It is about this whole transition finance is the way that I would put it, and that is what we are focused and committed on. And not, if you're not committed, our investors earlier, our investors used to, many investors used to have conversations with business heads. Now they want to have a 1-hour conversation with whoever is running the ESG framework for us in terms of how committed we are, how are we, how are we delivering on this on a day-to-day basis. And people are having a 1-hour conversation with that guy. Nobody wanted to talk to him before. Similarly, we've already done a 81 sustainable bond that creates further pressure on us to be able to be, for us to be committed to ESG. And I think it's an imperative that we will all have to go down, whether we like it or not.
If I may come in.
Yes, please.
Yeah, ESG is not a jargon anymore, if I could put it that way. Very, very clear signs of our moving down the ESG path, and investors into our funds. We have, as a fund house and as an industry, we have funds now which are fairly large, dedicated to ESG, climate, impact, this type of investments. The awareness, even among investors, is going up hugely, I must say, and specifically for such investments. And naturally, what happens is when we start looking at such investments, even the companies become more aware, and they also, over a period of time, get more and more responsible towards this. This is a very strong move. I repeat, this is not just jargon anymore, it's reality. And we are not far behind in our thought process in the Indian industry when we compare ourselves with the global thought process.
I think the key is to measure and make people aware. So as board members, what we are now doing is creating a tool to tell people where are you on these parameters and where can you be, and making that an annual board conversation, so that just throwing light on it and setting targets and giving energy to it itself will move a lot of companies to move that. So I think I'm happy to see that some of the public market measurement tools are also coming into play. Lately, there's been a lot of talk around ESG measurements, which probably even SEBI is considering. So I think measuring itself will bring some focus on it a lot more.
Thank you, Nitya. Thank you, Rajiv Sabharwal. Thank you, Rajiv Anand. And thank you, Vinay. We had a fascinating conversation about financing $5 trillion GDP and beyond. I hope our participants have benefited out of it. We have completely run out of time, but we look forward to your participation in future Bombay Chamber events. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah, so thank you everyone for this exciting session. Just to wind up, we had 2 excellent sessions today with clear pointers as to how we could and will achieve the 5 trillion mark by 2047. Incidentally, the chamber will turn just 211 years old in 2047, and will have played its part in reaching this milestone. We had Shri Ajay Piramal and Mr. Rajiv Kumar at a foundation day who gave us their vision on this subject a couple of weeks back. As you all know, we are recording this session. We recorded that session as well. And we will unveil this in 2047 to proudly boast that we told you so. At Bombay Chamber, we believe closely in engaging and collaborating with our members. Thank you, Axis Bank, Kotak Mahindra Mutual Fund, Tata Chemical Limited, True CSR, Arseva Solutions Private Limited, and Harinagar Sugar Mill for supporting and making today's webinar a grand success. I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Ms. Anjali Bansal, President Bombay Chamber, for taking time out today, even though she had a very bad throat and not COVID related. She assured us for delivering informative welcome address as we chart our path towards the $5 trillion mark. I would like to thank the board members, invitees, and all our members for participating, for taking time out from their busy schedule. All these activities of the Bombay Chamber cannot be accomplished without the strong and consistent support of the Chamber Secretariat. The hard work put in by my colleagues, Sugita and her team, Aishwarya and Priyanka, Mahadev and his IT team, and Prashant as in design and marketing team. Before we wind up today's proceeding, I would like to once again remind everyone about the 2 exciting sessions on post-budget analysis. One on taxation, scheduled on the 4th of Feb at 4 p.m. This will be moderated by Ms. Rajeshri Sabnavis, chairperson of our direct tax committee, and has Ms. Renuka Narvekar of TCS, Kalpesh Desai of KPMG, Shravan Kumar of L&T, and Frank D'Souza of Price Waterhouse as panelists. Indeed, a high-profile panel which will break down the implication of taxation for all of us. This is followed by a session on the 5th at 4 p.m. on the overall impact of the budget and how this will shape up our economy, the markets, and ensuring a long-term growth. This panel is being moderated by Dr. Shukla, Chairperson of our Economic Research Policy and Development, and as Nilesh Shah, Senior Vice President, Bombay Chamber, Professor Anant Narayan of SB Chain Institute of Management and Research, Mr. Utpal Seth of Trust, and Abhizar Diwanji of ENY. So I'm looking forward to meeting all of you on these two exciting sessions on the post-budget analysis. I'm sorry, my internet crashed halfway, so I'm not able to see the full panel. I'm operating from my cell. But thank you, panelists, once again for this exciting session. We are at 6:11. We had questions, but what I'll do is I'll take up all the questions and send it to y'all so that once you'll answer back, we will send it to all the panelists. Thank you, and have a safe and healthy evening. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.